Dr. Sotelo Castro is a Canadian Research Chair in Oral History Performance and Theatre, and he's co-director of the Center of Oral History and Digital Storytelling at Concordia University. He's also the director of his Acts of Listening Lab, in which he and his students investigate the transformative power of listening to personal narratives by survivors of social trauma. So they're looking at how to safely engage both specific target audiences and a wider general audience as reflective listeners of these personal narratives, and what benefit this has both to the individual and to society. So I've had the privilege of observing some of Luis's work through our collaboration, and I have to say it's a very interesting process, and very different to the way that we normally work on the scientific side. But it will be much more interesting for you to hear directly from him what this is all about. So I'd like to turn it over to him now. And after this talk, we'll have this roundtable discussion in which you will be able to ask him or I or his students anything you like about this process. So thank you for your attention, and Luis, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Well, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here with you and with your colleagues at the Perform Center and with the audience. In particular, thank you to the Scientific Events Committee who invited me. And as Emily is saying, so we're starting to collaborate on a project to see how we can use this knowledge, this technology that Emily has, in order to understand how performers go about listening to painful narratives, in the sense that they are narratives by people who have experienced violence. And in particular, in this project, I'm dealing with sexual violence. So I will share my screen as well. And so, yes, just to start by saying that the Acts of Listening Lab is, as you can see on the picture, a black box studio. So that's a kind of theatrical studio equipped with some sound technology, but it's basically a performance space. And so today I will be talking about this project, in which we're wondering how to engage performance audiences as listeners of a restorative justice process in the context of sexual violence or sexual abuse. And I will define those terms a little bit more in a moment. I just want to start by also acknowledging that this is a collaborative project. So I'm not alone. I'm here also with a person who was a victim of sexual violence and is also part of a Center for Restorative Justice in Montreal. I will explain what that is in a moment, but I understand she's here among the participants, and so you will get to hear from her later as well if she feels like participating. And also we have collaborators who are supporting the process, like Jennifer Drummond, the coordinator of the Sexual Assault Resource Center at Concordia, whom I think is also present. And we have two master's students working with us, one from drama therapy, the other one from the individualized masters. And they are supporting us in terms of dramaturgy, in terms of drama therapy, etc. And then we have a musician and also students from the theater department working in the project. Some opening questions. The most, one fundamental question is why to reperform narratives of sexual violence in public? There are so many funny stories, even fictional stories. Why to bother with difficult, painful narratives? And obviously, I don't have the full answer for that. Anyone, chooses has different purposes. The purpose here again has to do with kind of creating a space where publics can engage with something that they usually don't get engaged with, and that in any case requires our attention as society. And that is the experience of having either been abused sexually, or also the experience of listening to people who have committed sexual abuse, and to have a space where we can think together about why that happened without judgment, and more with the view of trying to really gain understanding. It's important to ask ourselves then, who performs, right? So in theater, in performance, there is always the risk that you appropriate someone else's story. So the question is, if performers are going to perform a real life person's story, you need to develop a trust, you need to develop a relationship, and this is an ethical affair. So we need to be mindful of who performs. I can say more about that, and perhaps during the Q&A, you can ask more questions, because this is an important question. However, an even more interesting question for our project is, who listens? Because very often in theater, in performance, even in film and TV and etc., you get to hear many stories, but very little is discussed about, okay, but who's watching or who's listening? And it matters because the reality is that when you engage with narratives by people who have survived violence, among the audience, you can also have other people who have been impacted by violence. So they are not just listeners, they are survivors as well. It's important, not only because of them, also say there are politicians or there are journalists. Everyone listens from a very specific perspective. So it's important to understand who listens, and it's important to understand how do they go about listening. So one thing that we're trying to do is to really focus on listening as a mode that can be acted upon, a mode of communication. And it's important to think about how do we go about listening. Again, I will say more about that in a moment. The function, what for? I mean, here, as I said, it has to do with bringing back to life a restorative justice process. And I will explain now what that is. But before, I just want to obviously note that there are risks involved in performing these narratives. And that's where the preventative health techniques come into question. So there are risks for the performers who are exposed to these narratives, listening to them repeatedly, but also for the public who are exposed to these narratives. I guess among you, many will probably know the term vicarious trauma, like getting trauma because of what you get to hear. So it evokes things in people, and it's important to be aware of that. And that's what we are also thinking to explore. We're exploring with Emily. So I will just jump to say that restorative justice, there are many different approaches to defining restorative justice. Basically, it's different from what it's called also retributive justice. So in the normal criminal justice system, the main question is who committed what crime as defined by the law, and usually these people get punished. Restorative justice is a process that is not necessarily delivered by like the criminal system, but by other providers. It can be extrajudicial, so it doesn't happen within the context of a process, of a legal process. And it's, in this case, we are collaborating with the Centre de Service de Justice Réparatrice. This is a center in Montreal. They have, for more than 10 years, they have been doing these services. And they focus more on really what they call victim-offender encounters. So they are facilitating encounters, say, between 3 victims of the same crime, 3 offenders of the same crime. They are not confronting their offender, right? But people who have experienced similar crimes. And they invite a member of the community or members of the community to be present. And then there is a facilitator, and they facilitate an encounter, a conversation where they exchange their experiences. And they listen to each other. And as a result of listening to each other, according to the CSGR's website, well, the participants gain awareness, in particular the victims and the offenders. They gain awareness of crime's impact. They have a lessening of destructive emotional impact because of knowing what the other person went through, why they did what they did. There is a better mutual understanding, right? But the biggest question is, okay, all these impacts are, all those effects are good for the victim and the offender mainly. But what happens if members of the community get exposed to these narratives and participate in the process, right? So that's more difficult to know, and that's what we want to explore. So basically, very often it is said that people who tell their stories of violence experience relief. So it's kind of a therapeutic value of storytelling. But here we're investigating the restorative value of story listening. Story is a term that it's tricky. I don't want to use it too much, because when people remember their trauma, they are not crafting a story. A story is something that perhaps it's crafted after, right? But let's use the term story for now. So the first stage of the research is the creative team, and that's performers, listening to the victim. And the creative team are a kind of case study or a kind of smaller version of a larger community. So the creative team plays two roles. They become performers, but they become also members of the community listening to the narratives. We are right now at this stage, and after the March break, we will move on to the second stage and see how we engage the audiences. But at the end, I hope we can have a conversation about both, like questions that you have about both stages. So as I said before, it does matter how people go about listening. So what we're doing here is we're using a methodology called headphones verbatim. Basically, you will see a clip in a moment, but basically the say in this case, the victim or the offender, they are interviewed, their interview is recorded, and the performer doesn't learn by heart the narrative. They don't transcribe the narrative either. They just listen through headphones to a fragment of the narrative and deliver the fragment verbatim, meaning like the exact words, right? So let me show you a clip to illustrate the process. And as we watch the clip, I will discuss a couple of things. So before we continue, I just want to highlight that, again, we're here at the Active Listening Lab. This is a Black video, and music plays a role. So one of the elements of the investigation is what is the role of music in the context of the performance of these traumatic memories. And one statement, one claim I want to make here is that music creates silences that amplify listening. So when the performer, the musician performs music, sometimes, you know, music has natural moments of pause, of break, and those moments are the transition for the audience to listen to the narrative. So please pay attention to the transition between the end of the guitar playing and then the headphones verbatim performance. Sorry.
So I will begin. My name is Brian McDonough. As I said a few minutes ago, I've had the privilege of not only participating but facilitating victim offender encounters.
So, yeah, you probably noticed the transition from the guitar to the start of the headphones verbatim. The performer, who I think is here within the audience, is delivering what she hears, and that's a facilitator called Brian, framing the event as a restorative justice process, right? It's important, and you will see here in a minute, to understand why it is so important to be listening to the exact words, and what does it do when you perform them, as opposed to simply perhaps just listen to them, but you perform them. So we will see in a minute the effect. But first, we will start by listening to a fragment of the person who experienced sexual violence. You will listen to it, and please pay attention to what you hear. I will ask Wendy to please enable the chat so that you hear the fragment, and in the chat after I will ask you to complete a task. So please listen carefully.
I want to thank you for being here and having an interest in this delicate subject, but very important subject. I'm touched that people are interested in making things known, and I believe in your project and what you're doing, and I find it wonderful. It was like more of a dream that this does exist, and it's nice to know that this does exist, that people do care enough to want to bring something that's real, no matter how much it might hurt, but to bring it to the public.
So thank you. What did you hear? Please write in the chat if you can remember any of the sentences, be as accurate as possible, and try to remember what did you hear. I'm not sure if people are writing in the chat because I cannot see it, but we will continue. So obviously this is only a short exercise. We would dedicate more time if we had, but I want you now to see and compare what you remembered with the performances using headphones verbatim technique by the theater students. Oh, okay, wait a minute. It will come after.
God, please heal even more.
A couple of days earlier, I was praying to God. I was asking God, I said, God, I need to go further.
Sorry, I guess I will have to go back, and so that you hear, because I'm actually making a mistake. There are two soundtracks that are different. So you will hear one by Julianne from here onwards. You are listening again to her, and you will also write in the chat what you hear.
A couple of days earlier, I was praying to God, and I was asking God, I said, God, I need to go further in my healing. Please find me a safe and secure place where I could go deeper, and I want to heal even more.
Okay, now please write down try to remember as many words as you can in the chat. And okay, doesn't matter that if you wrote one or two, that's fine. Now let's listen to the performers performing the same fragment using headphones verbatim.
couple of days earlier, I was praying to God. I was asking God, I said, God, I need to go further in my healing. Please find me a safe and secure place where I can go deeper, and I want to heal even more.
A couple of days earlier, I was praying to God and I said, I need to go further in my healing. Please find me a safe and secure place where I can go deeper, and I want to heal even more.
A couple of days earlier, I was praying to God and I was asking God, I need to go further in my healing. Please find me a safe and secure place where I can go deeper, and I want to heal even more.
A couple of days earlier, I was praying to God and I said, I need to go further in my healing. Please find me a safe and secure place where I could go deeper, and I want to heal even more.
So, well, here, listening, that's what I call, they are performing listening. So they are not just listening, they are also showing with their body and their entire subjectivity their process of listening. And then here is where I also feel there might be some risks for them, in the sense of listening through the body to painful narratives. And here is where with Emily, we want to wonder how to support listening in this context. And so, as I said, at this first stage, we're experimenting and we're exploring listening with the creative team. Later, for audiences listening to these performers performing these narratives, there is also the risks that they experience some, disturbing emotions. But about listening here, I also wanted to say that you noticed that each performer sounds different. It's like in many ways, a complete different performance of the exact same sentence. So this kind of technique is, yes, aiming for accuracy. And probably if you compare with the words that you remembered in your chat, you can see that our short-term memory obviously is limited. And this is a kind of memory technique. It's there, and in fact, it's not using memory, long-term memory. It's using just a very, the short-term memory that is involved in listening and immediately delivering what you are listening. And then there is a question: what happens if, by avoiding the long-term memory of the performer, we are perhaps helping them to prevent disturbing emotional impacts? That's a question. We need to investigate that. But the important thing as well about this project is that they are performing together with and for the victim who is present in the room, right? And so the victim is there simultaneously a listener of her own narrative being performed for her, to her, right? So that is a question. What is it doing for her? We believe that in many ways, and that's how we have been experiencing it, and as Julianne, it's her name, says herself, this helps her in her healing process. So listening to these narratives being performed by someone else is part of her healing journey. And so in many ways, what we are re-performing and reinforcing is a healing journey for her. But then the question is, for the performers and the wider audience, what is this listening doing, or what might be the function of listening? And I want to stress here that a victim of sexual violence, like in this case, someone who has experienced incest as a very young child, from her father, biological father, has a very damaging effect. And one of the most damaging effects has to do with the silencing that has gone with the sexual abuse. And silencing meaning don't speak about it, or if she tried to speak with her mom and finding support, really not finding the space to talk about it, and even being blamed for what had happened, which is a typical thing that happens, and it's called victims blaming, right? So the damaging effect is long lasting. And so this performance is trying to offer a space to act against it, but not only for the victim, also for offenders and also for the public. So at the end of the at the end of this track, let me show you a little bit, a little clip with a narrative, an excerpt from one offender who's collaborating in the project as well, right? So one of the tasks that students are going to do as well, and audiences later, is to also engage as listeners with the narrative of the offender. So we'll play an excerpt.
And when it started to sink in, I finally took possession of what I did. It is these hands that did that. Nobody else. And it's not because of my father or my mother or whatever. It's me. I'm fully responsible for what happened. I'm fully responsible for having taken that life. And I live in shame since then.
So, yeah, it's a powerful, also emotionally very powerful claim. I wonder if you take also like 10 seconds to write down on the chat any word that you remember from what he said, or any thought, any emotion. 10, 15 seconds. And this is exactly what we are experimenting with. How to offer you, the audience, a space to perform listening, to also connect with your own emotions as a listener, with your own memory, and to become a participant in something that becomes a kind of an assembly or a community where people gather to listen to something that has happened to a member of the community or two members of the community, and to start to cope with the problem as a group of people, right? So one of the challenges in the experiment, in the research processes, and that's going to be the second stage, is how to offer those spaces for audiences to become performers or participants, just as the actresses, the performers, are also performing herself, because in the process we are also stopping in between each performance and allowing performers to ask their questions, to pose to express their emotions. We are noticing that that is very important in their journey to prevent any kind of trauma on their side, because if they have that space, they don't go home with the questions. They ask the questions there, and Julianne is present to answer those questions, right? So we hope that for the audience is going to be something similar. And basically that takes us to think how to define, how to design a Q&A, or how to facilitate the encounter after with the audience, after they have listened, right? Listening is a physical act, and it starts with making presence to each other. So we need to build trust, make presence to each other, and try to give audiences tools, for instance, and also rules. So asking them not to listen and judge anything, but to try to practice what we call compassionate listening, which is listening without interrupting, listening for the roots, which is not always easy to do. There is an entire methodology. We don't have time here to discuss it. Just to finish, as a conclusion, I want to say that here it matters where you listen to these narratives. And the black box studio, the theater, is a theatrical frame. It's a formal setting. So it immediately enhances the performativity, so if you want, it becomes a solemn moment. And it's important that the listeners always have the opportunity to stop listening, to go. There is an open exit, that they can experience that there is ongoing consent. If at any point they decide they don't want to continue listening, they need to be given the option to just go and be offered listening support. So basically, it's all about how to build a safe space for both audiences, performances. And we're thinking that as opposed to what happens in a normal piece of theater where you go and stay, say 1, maximum 2 hours, we're thinking that here we need to create something that lasts 2 days, perhaps a 2 days workshop, because listening is not just an act, but a process. I will leave it there. Thank you very much. And I